The transition from the glass fortress of Julian's home to the cavernous reality of Studio 4 was jarring. If the Hollywood Hills were about the illusion of peace, the soundstage was about the manufacturing of emotion. It was a massive, windowless box of black plywood, smelling of sawdust, fresh paint, and the ozone of high-powered industrial lights. Claire stood near the edge of the set, her presence almost invisible to the 80-odd crew members rushing past her. She wore her charcoal hoodie like a shroud, her hands buried deep in her pockets, clutching a cold paper cup of tea. She watched as carpenters hammered together a replica of a bedroom that looked hauntingly like the one she had lived in for 2 years in Oak Ridge. It was surreal to see her private pain reconstructed in 3 dimensions for the world to see. Every prop, every shadow, every crack in the fake wall was based on a word she had written. She felt like a god watching the creation of a world she no longer wanted to inhabit. Then Julian appeared. He didn't come out with the usual fanfare of a movie star. He walked onto the set with a heavy, focused silence. They had spent 2 hours in makeup to make him look undone. His skin was pale, his eyes slightly reddened with irritation drops, and his expensive hair was matted and dull. He looked like the man Claire had seen in her dreams, the hollow shell. As he stepped into the light, his gaze didn't go to the director or the producers. It cut through the chaos of the crew and landed directly on Claire. It was a silent, magnetic pull, a look that said, "I am about to become your pain, watch me." Scene 22, take 1, the clapperboard snapped, clack. The silence that followed was absolute. The red on air light glowed above the doors like a warning. Julian sat on the edge of the prop bed. The scene was the mirror monologue, the one they had rehearsed in the hills. But here, under the unforgiving glare of the studio lights, it felt different. It felt dangerous. "I spend my life waiting for the sun to go down," Julian whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, stripped of all its cinematic polish. "Because in the dark, I don't have to be Julian Thorne. In the dark, I can just be a man who forgot how to breathe." He picked up a piece of charcoal, real charcoal, as Claire had insisted, and traced a line down his cheek. He wasn't acting, he was bleeding through his words. Claire felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest. She realized then that she hadn't just written a script, she had written a confession, and Julian was the only priest brave enough to hear it. "Cut, that was beautiful," Ava, the director, whispered into her headset. The lights dimmed slightly for a lens change, and the tension broke, but not for Julian. He stayed on the floor, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. Claire didn't think. For the first time in her life, she didn't analyze the social consequences. She stepped out of the shadows, crossing the cables and the taped lines on the floor. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder before finally making contact. The moment she touched him, a jolt of electricity seemed to pass through both of them. Julian looked up, his face smeared with black dust and real tears. He grabbed her hand, not a professional gesture, but the desperate grip of a drowning man. "I can't get out," he whispered, his eyes searching hers for a lifeline. "Claire," the words, "they're not letting me go." From the monitors, Marcus Vane watched the scene. He didn't see a writer and an actor. He saw 2 people who were becoming dangerously inseparable. He saw a goldmine of raw emotion, but he also saw a liability. "The chemistry is terrifying," Marcus whispered to his assistant, "but keep an eye on them. If she breaks him before we finish the pilot, we lose everything." Claire, however, didn't hear them. She only heard Julian's heartbeat through his palm. In the middle of the crowded, noisy studio, they were in their own script of silence. And the love that was beginning to bloom wasn't a Hollywood romance, it was a survival pact. The air outside the soundstage was a shock to the system, a mix of hot asphalt and the distant, salty breath of the Pacific. Julian didn't let go of Claire's hand as he led her toward his trailer, a massive, gleaming silver bullet of a vehicle that sat parked in the VIP row like a metallic god. The door of the trailer closed with a soft, pressurized thud, instantly killing the noise of the production. Inside, it didn't look like a celebrity's dressing room. It smelled of espresso, old leather, and the faint, sharp scent of the charcoal still on Julian's skin. The lighting was dim, amber, and warm, a stark contrast to the clinical, aggressive glare of the studio. Julian didn't sit on the plush velvet sofa. He leaned against the kitchenette counter, his chest still heaving from the emotional exertion of the scene. He looked at Claire, and for the first time there was no performance in his eyes. "I thought I knew what I was doing," Julian said, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "I've done 20 films, Claire. I've died on screen, I've loved on screen, I've screamed at the sky. But today I wasn't acting. I was just living your memories, and they're heavy. They're so damn heavy." Claire stood in the center of the narrow aisle. She felt the vibration of the trailer's air conditioning under her feet. She was usually the one who felt exposed, but now it was Julian who was naked in front of her. The golden boy was shattered, and she was the one who had broken him with her words. "You're not supposed to carry them, Julian," Claire said, her voice soft but echoing in the small space. "You're supposed to release them. I wrote that scene to get the ghost out of my room. You're supposed to let it fly away, not trap it in your own chest." "How can I let it go?" Julian asked, stepping closer until the heat from his body was palpable. "When the person who lived it is standing right in front of me. I can't look at the script without seeing your face in between the lines. I can't say the words without wondering if I'm hurting you all over again." The space between them shrunk. It wasn't the scripted distance of a director's blocking. It was the magnetic pull of two people who had spent their lives being watched but never seen. Julian reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, the charcoal dust still dark under his nails. He touched the edge of Claire's hoodie, then moved his hand up to cup her jaw. His skin was warm, a little rough and electric. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't retreat into her paper fortress. For the first time, she let someone in. "I spent my life hiding in the dark because the light was too loud," Claire whispered, her eyes locked on his. "But you brought your own light into my darkness, and for the first time it doesn't burn, it just warms." Julian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there, two shadows in a silver box, breathing the same air. The love story wasn't an explosion of roses and violins. It was a quiet, desperate recognition. "I don't care about the movie," Julian whispered against her skin. "I don't care about Apex or Marcus or the Mystery Girl headlines. I just want to be the one who understands you. I want to be the person you don't have to hide from." Claire felt a tear escape, not a tear of sadness, but a tear of release. The shadow had found a partner. The girl from Oak Ridge, who thought she was a freak, was being held by the man the world worshipped, and he was the one who felt lucky. A sharp knock on the trailer door shattered the moment. "Julian, 5 minutes to the next setup. Ava needs you for the lighting test." The world was calling them back. The machine didn't care about their souls, it only cared about the shot. Julian didn't move for a long second. He stayed there, his hand still on her face, his eyes searching hers for a promise. "Go," Claire whispered, her voice regaining its strength. "Go be the star, I'll be here, I'm not going anywhere." "You better not," Julian said, his voice thick with a new kind of determination. As he stepped out into the bright, fake sunlight of the studio, Claire stayed in the amber dimness of the trailer. She picked up a script page from the table. She didn't see lines of dialogue anymore. She saw a map of a heart, and for the first time, she knew exactly where she was going. As the heavy door of Julian's trailer creaked open, the artificial reality of the studio rushed back in like a flood. The temperature dropped, the smell of industrial sawdust replaced the scent of espresso, and the silence they had built inside that silver sanctuary was shattered by the shouting of assistant directors and the dragging of heavy equipment. Julian stepped out first. In an instant, his posture changed. His shoulders squared, his jaw set in that familiar leading man line, and his eyes, though still holding the residual heat of his moment with Claire, veiled themselves behind a professional curtain. He was back in the golden boy suit, even if it was smeared with charcoal. Claire followed a few paces behind. She felt the sudden weight of the 80 pairs of eyes on the set. It wasn't just the mystery girl curiosity anymore, it was something sharper. The air on the set felt thick with whispers that hadn't been voiced yet. Marcus Vane was standing near the main monitor, a tablet in one hand and a cold-pressed juice in the other. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at Claire. He watched the way she smoothed her hoodie, the way her eyes lingered on the back of Julian's head for a fraction of a second too long, and the way her neutral face was slightly flushed. Marcus was a man who built empires on optics. He knew that a tortured actor was a profitable actor, but a distracted actor was a disaster. To him, Claire was no longer just a genius writer. She was becoming a variable he couldn't control. "Claire," Marcus called out, his voice booming with a fake warmth that made her skin crawl. "A word, if you please, while Julian is getting his lighting marks." He led her toward the back of the soundstage, behind the massive velvet curtains that blocked out the real world. The darkness there was dusty and smelled of old theater. "The footage is incredible, Claire, truly," Marcus began, leaning against a crate of lenses. "The way Julian is responding to your direction, it's unprecedented. But I have to ask, as a friend of the production, is everything okay? You two spent quite a long time in that trailer." "We were discussing the subtext of the next scene," Claire replied, her voice gaining that icy, defensive edge she had perfected in Oak Ridge. She looked Marcus straight in the eye, refusing to be intimidated by his power. The dialogue needed adjustment to match the emotional weight of the performance. Of course, Marcus smiled, but the smile was like a razor blade. Just remember, Claire, Julian is a global asset. His image is worth hundreds of millions. The fans love the idea of him being lonely and tortured on screen, but they get very possessive if they think someone is, let's say, distracting him from his craft. He leaned in a bit closer, the smell of expensive mint and ambition wafting from him. There's already a lot of chatter online about the mystery girl. If this turns into a thing, the studio will have to protect the asset, and usually when that happens, the distraction is the one that gets replaced. I'd hate for such a brilliant writer to lose her seat at the table because she got too close to the fire. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. Marcus was telling her that in the hierarchy of Hollywood, she was a replaceable ghost, while Julian was a permanent monument. Claire felt the old familiar tremble in her hands, but this time it wasn't fear, it was rage. Julian isn't an asset, Marcus, he's a human being, and if you think protecting him means keeping him hollow, then you've never actually watched a single movie you've produced. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her boots clicking defiantly on the concrete floor. She headed back to the monitor, her heart pounding. She realized that her love for Julian wasn't just a personal matter, it was a revolutionary act against a machine that wanted to keep him a slave to his own fame. She looked over at the set. Julian was standing under a 10K light, the beams hitting him like a divine judgment. He looked up and caught her eye. In that moment, despite Marcus's threats and the cameras and the millions of dollars at stake, he gave her a secret, lopsided grin, the one that didn't belong to the golden boy. The war had begun. On one side was the machine of Apex Studios. On the other side was a girl from Oak Ridge and a man who was tired of being a statue. Claire opened her journal. She didn't write dialogue this time. She wrote a vow. They think they can edit us out of the story. They don't realize I'm the one holding the pen. The atmosphere on the set of The Script of Silence had been one of focused, almost religious intensity. But at 2:14 p.m. the energy shifted. It didn't happen with a bang, but with a ripple, a synchronized vibration of dozens of smartphones tucked into the pockets of crew members, assistants, and stylists. Claire was sitting in her canvas chair, her eyes fixed on the monitor as Julian performed a quiet, heartbreaking scene in a simulated rainstorm. Suddenly, she noticed the video village, the area where the producers and assistants sit, start to buzz. People weren't looking at Julian anymore. They were looking at their screens. They were whispering, their eyes darting toward Claire with a mixture of pity and predatory curiosity. Her own phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from an unknown number. She pulled it out, her fingers suddenly cold. It was a link to a major blind item gossip site. The headline read, "The Ghostwriter's Dirty Little Secret." Underneath was the video. It was grainy, filmed on a shaky cell phone camera 3 years ago. It was Claire younger, looking smaller and more fragile, trapped in a bathroom stall at St. Jude. She was sobbing, her hands over her ears, while voices off camera, Sarah and her friends mocked her, calling her a freak, a mute, and a waste of space. The video ended with someone throwing a cup of water over the stall door, soaking the girl who just wanted to disappear. The world around Claire seemed to tilt. The high-definition monitors, the expensive cameras, the smell of the fake rain, it all felt like a cruel joke. She wasn't the genius writer anymore. She was that girl in the stall. The water felt like it was hitting her all over again, chilling her to the bone in the middle of a heated soundstage. She looked up and saw Marcus Vane. He wasn't looking at the video with shock, he was looking at it with calculation. He looked at Claire, then at Julian, who was still standing in the rain, unaware that the girl he was beginning to love was being dismantled on the internet. Cut. Ava's voice didn't sound satisfied this time. It sounded distracted. The lights on the set stayed up. Usually the crew would move to reset, but now they stood still, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their phones. The silence was no longer creative, it was judgmental. Claire felt the walls of the studio closing in. The paper fortress hadn't just been breached, it had been demolished. She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of sand. She needed to run. She needed to find a bathroom stall and lock herself in, just like the video. As she turned to bolt toward the exit, a hand caught her arm. It wasn't a producer or a security guard. It was Julian. He had walked off the set, dripping wet from the rain, ignored the towel his assistant tried to give him, and marched straight to Claire. He didn't have his phone. He didn't know about the video yet, but he knew Claire. He saw the St. Jude's look in her eyes, the look of a ghost being hunted. "Claire, what happened?" he asked, his voice cutting through the whispers of the crew. "I have to go, Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking. I shouldn't have come here. I'm not who you think I am." Marcus Vane stepped forward, holding his tablet like a weapon. Julian, perhaps you should take a look at this before you get too involved. The internet is having a field day. It's not a good look for the production. We're being associated with, well, with this." He handed the tablet to Julian. Claire watched Julian's face as he watched the video. She expected to see disappointment. She expected him to see the freak and realize his muse was just a broken girl from a small town. Instead, she saw something much more terrifying. She saw Julian's face turn into a mask of pure, unadulterated coldness. His grip on Claire's arm didn't loosen, it tightened, grounding her. He didn't look at the tablet for long. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time, Julian Thorne looked like a man who was ready to burn his own career to the ground. "Is this what you're worried about, Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous resonance. "A girl being bullied by cowards, you think this makes her look bad?" Julian turned to the entire crew, his voice rising, commanding the attention of every person in the room. "If anyone on this set, anyone, is seen sharing this video or mocking this woman, you can consider your contract terminated. And if the studio thinks they can use her past to protect my image, they can find a new lead for this show. Because I'm not playing a golden boy anymore. I'm playing the man she created, and I won't let the world hurt her twice." The studio went silent, not a whisper, not a phone tap. Julian turned back to Claire, his eyes softening into a deep, oceanic blue. He didn't care about the water dripping from his clothes or the millions of dollars at stake. "Don't you dare run, Claire," he whispered so only she could hear. "They've seen the video. Now let's show them the ending you wrote. Let's show them who the genius really is." The silence that followed Julian's declaration in Studio 4 was thick, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Julian didn't wait for Marcus Vane to respond, nor did he look back at the cameras. He kept his hand firmly on Claire's arm, leading her out of the video village, through the maze of cables, and back toward the only place where the world felt small enough to handle, his trailer. Inside the aluminum walls, the air was still warm from their earlier encounter, but the atmosphere had changed. The amber lights felt like a blurred dream. Claire stumbled slightly as she reached the small velvet sofa, her strength finally deserting her. She sat down, her hands tucked between her knees, her shoulders hunched as if she were still trying to hide from the water thrown over that bathroom stall 3 years ago. She wasn't crying, she was beyond tears. She was in the freeze state, the psychological paralysis where the soul tries to eject from a body that is in too much pain. Julian didn't say a word, he didn't offer a platitude like, "It'll be okay." He knew better. He stripped off his soaked gray shirt, the one from the rain scene, and threw it into the corner. He grabbed a clean, oversized black hoodie from his closet and draped it over Claire's shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of the expensive sandalwood cologne that had become her only anchor in this city. He knelt on the floor in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His hair was still damp, sticking to his forehead, and his eyes were a fierce, burning blue. "Look at me, Claire," he commanded, his voice a low, steady vibration. "Not at the screen, not at the ghost of that girl, look at me." Claire slowly raised her head. Her eyes were hollow, reflecting the dim lights of the trailer. "They saw it," she whispered, her voice sounding like dry parchment. "All of them, the crew, the producers, everyone who's going to watch this show. Now, whenever they read my words, they won't see the voice. They'll see the girl in the stall. They'll see the freak who couldn't even fight back." "No," Julian interrupted, his hands reaching up to cover hers. His grip was a solid, grounding weight. "They saw a girl being treated like a monster by people who weren't worthy of breathing her air. But more importantly, they saw the woman she became despite them. Claire, you didn't just fight back. You turned their hatred into a masterpiece. You took the silence they forced on you and made the whole world listen to it." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. The intimacy was no longer about a script or a rehearsal. It was a collision of two lonely orbits. "Do you know why I'm so angry?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not angry because they found out. I'm angry because I wasn't there to stand in front of that stall. I'm angry that you had to carry that alone for 3 years, but you're not alone anymore. Do you hear me? I will burn this entire industry down before I let them use your pain for marketing or scandal." Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the crack in his own armor. She saw that Julian Thorne wasn't just being a hero. He was terrified, too. He was terrified of losing the only person who had ever seen the man behind the monument. "Why?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you risk everything for me? You're the golden boy, you have the world, I'm just the girl who writes." Julian gave a small, sad laugh. He reached up, his thumb brushing a stray, cold tear from her cheek. "Because I was a ghost before you came along, Claire. I was just a walking, talking image that belonged to everyone and no one. You gave me a soul. You gave me words that felt like my own. I'm not the golden boy. I'm just a man who is desperately in love with a girl who thinks she's a shadow, but doesn't realize she's the only light I've seen in a decade." The word love hung in the air of the trailer like a held breath. It was the first time it had been spoken, and it felt heavier than any dialogue Claire had ever written. She didn't answer with words, she couldn't. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her head against his bare shoulder, closing her eyes as the warmth of his body seeped into her. For the first time since leaving Oak Ridge, the paper fortress felt truly secure, not because the walls were thick, but because someone else was standing at the gate. The warmth of the trailer felt like a bubble of gold in a world of gray, but even gold has a melting point. The soft hum of the air conditioning was suddenly drowned out by a persistent, sharp rapping on the aluminum door. It wasn't the respectful knock of an assistant, it was the rhythmic, demanding beat of authority. Julian didn't move for a second, his arms still wrapped around Claire, his chin resting on her head. He looked like he wanted to stay in that cocoon forever, but the knock came again, louder, more insistent. "Julian, it's Marcus, open up, we need to talk, now." Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The sandalwood scent of Julian's hoodie, which she was still wearing, felt like a borrowed identity. She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting Julian's. He looked tired, but his gaze was flinty and hard. "Stay here," he whispered, his thumb grazing her cheek one last time. "Don't come out until I tell you." Julian stepped out, closing the door firmly behind him. Claire could hear their voices through the thin walls of the trailer, muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Marcus was in damage control mode. "The video has 3 million views, Julian." Marcus's voice rose, vibrating with corporate panic. "The sponsors are calling. They're seeing a victim narrative attached to our leading man. It's messy. It's indie drama, not a global blockbuster." "She's not a narrative, Marcus. She's the writer. And she's my—" Julian's voice cut off, the word partner or love hanging in the throat of the afternoon air. "You're what? Your mistake." Marcus's voice dropped to a low, poisonous hiss. "The studio has made a decision. We're going to offer her a generous buyout. She'll get full credit for the pilot, but she needs to leave the set immediately. We'll bring in a fixer, a seasoned writer to handle the rest of the season, someone without baggage." Inside the trailer, Claire stood frozen. Baggage. The word hit her harder than the water in the stall ever could. To Marcus Vane, her trauma wasn't a source of art, it was a PR liability. She looked at her reflection in the small, polished mirror of the trailer. She looked small in Julian's oversized hoodie, her face pale, her eyes dark. "They want to erase me again," she thought. "First Sarah, now the world. They want the script of silence without the person who had to live through the silence." "If she leaves, I leave," Julian's voice boomed outside, clear and unwavering. "Don't be a fool, Julian. You have a contract. We'll sue you for every cent you've made in the last decade. You'll be a has-been before the sun sets." "Then I'll be a has-been with a soul," Julian replied. "You don't get it, Marcus. You think you're protecting my image. My image is a lie, this girl and the words she writes. That's the only real thing I've touched in years. You send her away and you can film the empty set, because I'm not coming back." Claire realized she couldn't let him do it. She couldn't let him burn his empire for her, not because she didn't love him, but because that's exactly what her enemies wanted, to prove she was a distraction, a curse. She walked toward the trailer door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, but her mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She wasn't the girl in the stall. She was the one holding the pen. She pushed the door open. The bright California sun hit her eyes, blinding her for a second. Julian and Marcus were standing 3 feet away, locked in a tense standoff. Marcus looked at her with pure, unadulterated coldness. Julian looked at her with a mixture of fear and pride. "I'm not leaving, Marcus," Claire said, her voice small but carrying a resonance that made both men turn. "And Julian isn't quitting." She stepped down the stairs, standing beside Julian. She didn't hide behind him. She stood on her own 2 feet, the heavy hoodie sleeves covering her hands. "The video is out there, you can't delete it," Claire said, looking Marcus straight in the eye. "But you can't delete me either. If you bring in a fixer, the soul of this show dies, and you know it. Julian knows it. The cameras know it." "So what do you suggest, genius?" Marcus sneered, his arms crossed. "We don't hide the video," Claire said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We use it. We release a statement. I'll do an interview. I'll tell them exactly who I am. I'll turn the scandal into a conversation about the very thing the show is about, the strength of the silent. You want a global hit, Marcus. Give them something they've never seen, the truth." Marcus blinked. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at a strategist. He looked at Julian, who was watching Claire with a look of pure, unbridled worship. The machine was still there, but it had a glitch, a beautiful, brilliant glitch from Oak Ridge. An interview, Marcus asked, his tone shifting from predatory to calculating. With who? If we do this, it has to be big. With whoever is brave enough to listen, Claire replied. Julian reached out and took her hand, right there in front of the producer, in front of the crew who were still whispering. He squeezed it tight. I'm with her, Julian said, and if you try to spin this, Marcus, I'll go to the press myself and tell them how you tried to fire a woman for being a victim of a crime. Your choice. The red light was still glowing in the distance, but for the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was being hunted. She felt like she was the one leading the chase. The decision was made, but the weight of it felt like an anchor dragging behind them. Apex Studios had moved with lightning speed. Once Marcus Vane saw a way to monetize the truth, he became its biggest advocate. They booked a primetime slot with one of the most respected journalists in the country. 24 hours before the interview, Julian's penthouse was no longer a home, it was a simulation. He had brought in professional lighting, a mock set, and 3 assistants to play the roles of camera operators. He wanted Claire to be ready. He knew that the wolves of the media would look for any crack in her armor. Claire sat in a velvet chair in the center of the room. She felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. The lights were aggressive, hot, and unforgiving. Don't look at the lens, Claire, Julian said, packing behind the camera. He wasn't the lover right now. He was the mentor, the veteran of 1,000 interrogations. Look at the person. If you look at the glass, you'll see 1,000,000 people. If you look at the person, you'll only see a soul. Let's try again, Julian said, his voice firm but laced with a hidden tenderness. They're going to ask you about the video. They're going to ask why you didn't fight back. They're going to try to make you feel small again so they can pity you. What do you say? Claire took a breath. The air in the room felt thin. I say that silence wasn't my weakness. It was my survival. I didn't fight back with my hands because I was busy fighting back with my mind. I was building a world they couldn't touch. Better, Julian said, stepping into the light. He walked over and knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. But don't say it like you're defending yourself. Say it like you're educating them. You are the one with the genius label, Claire. They are the ones who are illiterate in the language of the soul. The rehearsal stopped. The assistants were dismissed to the kitchen for a break. In the sudden silence of the penthouse, the tension between them shifted from professional to painfully personal. Julian reached out and traced the dark circles under Claire's eyes. He hadn't slept much either. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that video, and it fueled a protective rage that he had to suppress to keep her calm. I'm scared, Julian, Claire whispered, leaning her forehead against his shoulder. What if they don't see the writer? What if they only see the victim? What if I break under the lights? Then I'll be right there in the front row, Julian promised, his hands sliding into her hair. And if you break, I'll catch the pieces, but you won't break, Claire, because you've already survived the worst thing they can throw at you. This is just theater. You're the one who wrote the play. They spent the rest of the night not on the mock set, but on the balcony. The city of Lowe's angels stretched out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. The wind smelled of blooming jasmine and sea salt. Julian brought out a soft cashmere blanket, wrapping it around both of them as they sat on the outdoor lounge. For hours, they didn't talk about the interview. They talked about the little things, the things they had missed while being ghosts. Julian told her about his childhood in London, the pressure of being a child actor, the feeling of losing his identity before he even knew what it was. Claire told him about the woods in Oak Ridge, the specific way the light hit the creek in the autumn, and the first poem she ever wrote on the back of a grocery receipt. As the sun began to peek over the canyons, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and soft gold, Julian turned to her. One last thing, he said, his eyes searching hers. Tomorrow, the world is going to try to own a piece of you. They'll take your photo, they'll quote your words, they'll analyze your past, but they don't get the real Claire. That belongs only to you, and if you'll let it, to me. Claire looked at the man who had traded his golden boy pedestal for a seat on the floor beside her. She didn't feel like a shadow anymore. She felt like a lighthouse, tired, weathered by the waves, but finally lit from within. They can have the image, Claire said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. I'm keeping the soul. The studio was a cathedral of high-tech coldness. Steel blue lights, silent cameras that glided on tracks like predatory snakes, and a professional crew that spoke in hushed, clinical tones. It was the lion's den, and tonight, Claire was the main attraction. Claire sat in the makeup chair, her reflection looking back at her like a stranger. They hadn't tried to make her look like a star. They had made her look like herself, but sharpened. A simple black silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat but soft bun, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and survived. She could feel the tremble trying to start in her knees. She looked at her hands, they were ice cold. 20 minutes, miss, a stage manager whispered. Suddenly, the heavy soundproof door opened. Julian walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there. The studio had wanted her alone for the optics. But Julian didn't care about optics. He was wearing a dark suit, looking every bit the golden boy, but his eyes were fixed only on the girl in the chair. He walked over, stood behind her, and placed his hands on her shoulders. His touch was a grounding wire. The warmth of his palms seeped through the silk of her blouse, settling the chaos in her chest. "I'm right behind the camera," he whispered into her ear. "If you get lost, just look for the red light. I'll be standing exactly 3 inches to the left of it. Talk to me, Claire, just me." "I don't think I can do this, Julian," she whispered back, her voice cracking. "The video, it's all they're talking about in the pre-show." "The video is the before," Julian said, turning her chair to face him. He knelt down, ignoring the makeup artist's protest. "Tonight is the after. You are the author of this story, remember. Now go out there and finish the chapter." The walk to the set felt like a mile. Claire sat across from Diane Sterling, a journalist known for dissecting celebrities, with a smile. The lights hit them, blinding hot in total. 3, 2, 1, we're live, the floor director signaled. "Tonight," Diane started, her voice smooth as honey, "we are joined by the mysterious mind behind the most anticipated show of the year, the script of silence. Claire, a lot has been said about you in the last 48 hours. A video from your past has surfaced, a very painful one. How does it feel to have your most private trauma become public property?" The question was a trap. It was designed to make her cry, to make her play the victim for the ratings. Claire felt the familiar urge to vanish, but then she looked past the cameras. There in the shadows she saw a silhouette, Julian. He was standing exactly where he promised, his arms crossed, his head tilted. He wasn't looking at the monitors, he was looking at her with a pride so intense it felt like a shield. Claire took a breath. She didn't look at Diane. She looked into the lens, into the eyes of the millions of silence watching from their own dark rooms. "It doesn't feel like property, Diane," Claire said, her voice starting low but gaining a terrifying, quiet strength. "Because you can't own a shadow." The girl in that video was being taught that her voice didn't matter. She was being told that her silence was a cage, but what those people and what the world didn't realize is that I wasn't trapped in that cage. I was in there writing the key to get out. The studio went dead quiet. Even Diane Sterling blinked, her scripted follow-up question forgotten. "I didn't suffer for this show," Claire continued, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with the fire of Oak Ridge. "I survived for it, and if the world wants to watch that video, I hope they see more than a girl being bullied. I hope they see the moment I decided that I would never, ever be quiet again. My silence isn't a lack of words, Diane, it's a choice, and tonight I choose to speak." The interview went on for an hour. Claire didn't stumble, she didn't break. She talked about the power of the unseen, the beauty of the broken, and the man who had been brave enough to read her words. When the red off-air light finally flickered out, the entire crew, the cynical, tired Hollywood veterans, stood up and did something they never did. They applauded. Claire stood up, her legs finally steady. She didn't look at the applause, she looked toward the shadows. Julian was already moving toward her. He didn't care about the cameras that might still be rolling. He grabbed her and pulled her into a hug so tight it felt like they were becoming one person. "You did it," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You just changed the world, Claire." "No," she whispered back, closing her eyes. "We did it." The drive back to the Chateau Marmont felt like floating through a city made of liquid neon. The SUV was quiet, but the silence was no longer a heavy, suffocating thing. It was a shared exhale. Outside the tinted windows, the world was still buzzing. Claire's name was trending on every social platform. The interview of the year was being clipped and shared by millions. But inside the car, there was only the scent of Julian's sandalwood and the soft hum of the tires against the pavement. Julian hadn't let go of Claire's hand since they left the studio. His thumb was tracing slow, rhythmic circles on the back of her palm, a gesture of grounding that felt more intimate than a kiss. He looked out at the lights of the Sunset Strip, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. "You look different," Julian said suddenly, his voice low and raspy. "I feel lighter," Claire admitted. She leaned her head back against the leather seat, watching the palm trees blur past. "Like I finally stopped holding my breath after 3 years. I told the truth, Julian, I didn't hide." "You did more than that," Julian whispered, turning to look at her. The passing streetlights flickered across his face, highlighting the raw admiration in his eyes. "You took their scandal and turned it into a mirror. They wanted to see a victim, and you showed them a queen. I've never seen anything more beautiful in my life." When they reached the penthouse, the nest Claire had built on the floor was gone. The maids had cleaned the room, but it didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a sanctuary that had finally been earned. Julian didn't leave. He followed her in, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair. He loosened his tie, looking exhausted but vibrantly alive. Claire walked to the French doors, opening them to let in the night air. The sounds of LA, the distant sirens, the muffled bass of a club, felt like background noise to a much more important story happening inside. Claire turned to face him. Now that the lights were off and the cameras were gone, the adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a profound, aching vulnerability. "What happens now?" she asked. "Marcus is happy because the ratings will be huge. The silence are inspired, but what happens to us, Julian? When the show is over and the lights are packed away, do I go back to being a ghost?" Julian walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the oak floor. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body radiating toward her. "You were never a ghost to me, Claire. You were the only real thing in a city of mannequins," he said, reaching out to cup her face with both hands. His touch was firm, possessive, yet incredibly gentle. "The show isn't the story. We are, and I'm not letting you go back to Oak Ridge. I'm not letting you hide again, unless you want to hide with me." The air between them became electric, pressurized. Claire looked up into those blue eyes, the ones she had written about before she even knew they existed, and saw her future. "I don't want to hide anymore," she whispered. Julian leaned down, and this time there was no hesitation. The kiss wasn't a Hollywood kiss, it wasn't scripted, and there was no director to shout cut. It was a collision of two people who had been starving for something real. It tasted like bitter coffee and salt and the relief of finally being found. But outside, in the carpeted hallway of the chateau, the world was still conspiring. Marcus Vane was on the phone, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his screen. "I don't care about their love story," Marcus hissed into his headset. "The interview worked too well. She's becoming more famous than the show itself. If we don't control the narrative now, she'll have more power than the studio. Find me something else on her, or better yet, find me something on Julian that she doesn't know about. I want a wedge between them before the premiere, a big one." Inside the room, Claire and Julian were oblivious to the predator at the door. They were sitting on the balcony, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the sun begin to hint at the horizon. "We're in the red light now," Claire whispered, referring to the on-air signal. "Let it stay red," Julian replied, kissing her temple. "I like the way we look in this light." The morning after the interview felt like the world had been repainted in high definition. As Claire and Julian walked onto the set of Studio 4, the atmosphere wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. The grips, the gaffers, the makeup artists, they didn't just look at Claire, they looked at her with a new kind of respect. She was no longer the mystery girl. She was the heartbeat of the project. "Morning, Claire," Ava, the director, said, giving her a quick, meaningful squeeze on the arm. "The network just called. They're doubling the budget for the pilot. They want more of your voice. Whatever you need, you get it." Claire felt a rush of something she had never experienced, authority. She looked at Julian, who was getting his touch-ups nearby. He winked at her through the mirror, a private smile that said, "I told you so." But while the crew was celebrating, Marcus Vane was lurking in the wings. He didn't look angry, he looked satisfied. He approached Claire during the lunch break, holding a thick manila envelope. "A triumph, Claire, a total triumph," Marcus said, his voice smooth as expensive silk. "You've done wonders for the brand. As a token of the studio's appreciation and as a sign of our transparency, I thought you should have this. Consider it research for the character's backstory." "What is it?" Claire asked, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Just some old files from Julian's early days, before he was the golden boy. Every hero has a messy origin story, right? Since you're writing his soul, you should probably know about the parts he forgets to mention." Claire took the envelope to her trailer, not the little one they gave her at the start, but a new, larger one. She sat in the dim light and opened it. Inside were photos and legal documents from 10 years ago. They showed a much younger Julian, looking hollow and wild-eyed. There were police reports about a controlled substance incident that had been buried by a multi-million-dollar settlement, but it wasn't the drugs that stopped her heart. It was a contract, a non-disclosure agreement signed by a girl named Mia. The documents detailed an incident where Julian, in a blackout state, had been involved in a car accident that nearly cost Mia her life. The studio hadn't just paid for her medical bills, they had paid for her silence. They had deleted a person's tragedy to keep a star's light shining. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. The girl in the documents, Mia, sounded like her. Someone who had been silenced by power. Someone whose story had been bought so that the golden boy could keep his pedestal. "Is this why he understands me?" Claire whispered to the empty trailer. "Is it because he knows how to silence people, or because he's been the one throwing the water all along?" She didn't wait, she walked straight to Julian's trailer. She didn't knock. She burst in, the documents clutched in her hand like a smoking gun. Julian was sitting at his desk, reading a new scene she had written. He looked up, his face lighting up with that genuine, warm smile, the one that usually made her feel safe. But today, it felt like a mask. "Claire, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a..." He stopped when he saw the manila envelope. His face went from warm to ghostly pale in a fraction of a second. The golden boy vanished, replaced by the terrified boy in the police reports. "Where did you get that?" Julian asked, his voice a low, broken rasp. "Marcus gave it to me," Claire said, her voice trembling with a mix of betrayal and fury. "He called it research. Tell me, Julian, the girl in the car, Mia, did you pay for her silence, or did you just delete her like everyone else who gets in the way of the light?" Julian stood up, but he didn't move toward her. He looked like a man standing on a gallows. "I didn't delete her, Claire," Julian whispered, his eyes filling with a raw, agonizing guilt. "I've spent 10 years trying to pay for that night, but you're right, I'm not the man you think I am. I'm the man who needed a script of silence just to stay alive." The silence in the trailer was no longer a sanctuary, it was a courtroom. And Claire, the girl who hated bullies, realized she might be in love with the biggest bully of them all, the one who could silence the world with a checkbook. The air in Julian's trailer was no longer the scent of sandalwood and safety, it was the smell of old dust and cold iron. Claire stood there, the documents in her hand feeling like lead weights. She looked at Julian, the man she had just begun to trust with her soul, and saw a stranger built of secrets and settlements. Julian didn't try to take the papers from her. He slumped back into his chair, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. The golden boy wasn't just cracked, he was shattered. "I was 21, Julian began, his voice barely a whisper, eyes fixed on the floor. "I was the it boy. I felt invincible, and I was drunk on the power everyone kept handing me. That night, it wasn't just a car accident, Claire. It was the end of who I thought I was. I didn't even know I'd hit her until the sirens started." "And the NDA?" Claire asked, her voice sharp as a razor. "The girl, Mia, you paid her to disappear. You did exactly what Sarah did to me in that bathroom. You made sure her voice didn't exist so your image could stay perfect." "I didn't want the money to be for silence." Julian suddenly stood up, his face flushed with a desperate, agonizing rage at himself. "I wanted to give her everything. I wanted to go to jail, but the studio, the lawyers, they stepped in. They told me if I went public, I'd destroy the livelihoods of the 200 people working on my show. They made me sign Claire. They bought her a new life in Europe and bought me a cage of gold. I've lived with that ghost every single day for 10 years. Why do you think I can play the hollow man so well? It's not acting, it's a confession." Claire felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the man she loved and saw the very machine she hated. But she also saw the truth in his eyes, the same haunting pain she saw in her own mirror. He wasn't the bully, he was the bully's most expensive product. "You're just like me," Claire whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "We're both scripted, Julian. I was silenced by fear and you were silenced by fame. But the result is the same, we're both lies." Before Julian could respond, the trailer door opened without a knock. Marcus Vane stepped in, looking as calm as a shark in still water. He looked at the papers on the floor, then at the two of them. "I see the research was enlightening," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Now that the air is clear, can we get back to the set? We have $1 million scene to shoot and the truth doesn't pay the bills. Claire, I assume you'll be professional about this. After all, Julian's career is now tied to yours. If he falls, your genius debut goes down with him." Claire looked at Marcus, the man who had held the water cup over the stall door of Julian's life. Then she looked at Julian, who was waiting for her judgment like a man on the gallows. The tremble in Claire's hands stopped. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She realized that Marcus hadn't given her those files to help her. He had given them to her to break her, to make her feel like she had no moral high ground, to make her just another cog in the studio's machine. "You think this changes the script, Marcus?" Claire asked, her voice sounding like ice snapping. "I think it ensures your loyalty," Marcus smiled. "Then you're a worse reader than I thought," Claire said. She walked over to Julian, but she didn't hug him. She stood beside him, facing Marcus. "The scene we're shooting today is about the moment the protagonist realizes his father is a liar. I was going to write it as a tragedy, but now I'm going to write it as an execution. Julian, get your makeup touched up. We're going to give Marcus exactly what he wants, a performance he'll never forget." Marcus's smile faltered. He looked at the two of them, the broken star and the ghost writer, and for the first time he saw something he couldn't calculate: defiance. As Marcus left the trailer, Claire turned to Julian. The air was still heavy, the wound was still open, but the red light was glowing. I don't forgive you yet, Julian, Claire said, her eyes hard and bright. But I'm not going to let him use your sins to bury my voice. We finish this show. We tell the truth through the fiction, and when the cameras stop, then we find out if there's anything left of us to save. Julian nodded, a single tear cutting through the charcoal dust on his face. Whatever you need, Claire, I'm yours, even the broken parts. The atmosphere in Studio 4 had shifted from reverent to electric. Word had leaked through the crew that something had happened in the trailer. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The scene was the confrontation. In the script, Julian's character, Elias, had to confess his darkest secret to the woman he loved. Before the manila envelope incident, it was a scene about seeking forgiveness. Now, Claire had taken her pen and shredded the dialogue, replacing it with something raw, jagged, and terrifyingly honest. "We're ready for you, Julian," Ava, the director, called out. She looked at Claire, who was standing behind the monitors, her face a mask of cold marble. "Claire, these new lines, they're brutal, are you sure?" "Truth isn't a soft thing, Ava," Claire replied, her voice steady. "Let's roll." The red light flickered on. Clack. Julian stood in the middle of the reconstructed living room. He looked at the actress playing his love interest, but his eyes kept drifting toward Claire, who was invisible in the darkness behind the lens. He knew these words weren't for the character, they were for him. "I thought if I bought enough flowers, the smell of the rot would go away," Julian said, his voice cracking, not because the script told him to, but because his soul was breaking. "I thought if I signed enough checks, the ghosts would stop screaming, but the silence is just a louder way of lying." The crew stopped breathing. This wasn't acting. This was a man being flayed alive by his own words. Julian's performance was so visceral, so agonizingly real, that the cameras seemed to vibrate. Claire watched him through the monitor. She saw the golden boy disintegrate. She saw the man who had hidden behind NDAs and studio lawyers finally standing naked in the light of his own truth. Part of her wanted to run to him to tell him it was okay. But the writer in her, the girl from Oak Ridge who had been silenced for so long, knew that this was the only way he could be redeemed. He had to bleed for the camera so he wouldn't have to bleed in the dark. Marcus Vane stood in the back of the studio, his jaw clenched. He had wanted to control Claire, but he had accidentally unleashed a monster. He saw his asset, Julian, breaking down, but he also saw the most incredible footage he had ever witnessed. "Cut," Ava shouted, her voice trembling. The studio remained silent for a full 10 seconds after the command. No one moved. Julian stayed on his knees on the set, his head bowed, the fake rain from the overhead pipes soaking into his expensive costume. Claire stepped out from behind the monitors. She walked onto the set, her boots splashing in the artificial puddles. She stood over Julian, just like she had in the trailer, but the anger had been replaced by a heavy, profound sadness. She reached down and handed him a towel. "That was the truth," she whispered, so only he could hear. Julian looked up at her, his eyes red and exhausted. "Is it enough to pay for Mia, to pay for the silence?" "It's a start," Claire said, "but the camera doesn't grant labels, Julian. It only captures what's there. Tonight, you weren't a lie." As they walked off the set together, the power dynamic had completely inverted. The studio didn't own them anymore, they owned the moment. Marcus Vane tried to approach them, but Julian didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on Claire, the woman who had used her paper fortress to build him a path back to humanity. But the machine wasn't finished. Marcus saw the footage and knew he had a masterpiece, but he also knew he had lost his leverage. "Get the PR team on the phone," Marcus whispered to his assistant. "If we can't break them apart, we'll turn their tragic pasts into a marketing campaign. We'll sell their pain like it's candy." The production of the script of Silence had wrapped, leaving behind an eerie stillness in Studio 4. The fake walls were torn down, the rain pipes dismantled, but the air still felt thick with the emotions that had been spilled there. For Claire, the end of filming wasn't a relief, it was the beginning of a different kind of claustrophobia. The mystery girl was a mystery no longer. Everywhere Claire went, she felt the invisible touch of the public eye. In the lobby of the Chateau Marmont, the staff bowed a little deeper. On the streets, people whispered as she passed in the back of the studio SUV. She had become the voice of the broken, a title that felt like a crown made of thorns. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume even when I'm in my pajamas," Claire told Julian one evening. They were in his penthouse, surrounded by racks of designer clothes for the upcoming premiere. Julian was standing by the window, a glass of water in his hand. He looked thinner, more haunted, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. The Mia secret was out between them, and though it hadn't been fully healed, the air was no longer poisoned by lies. "That's the red light, Claire," Julian said, his voice reflecting a weary wisdom. It never really turns off. Once the world decides you're a hero, they won't let you be a human anymore. Marcus doesn't want Claire from Oak Ridge on that red carpet. He wants the tragic genius. He wants you to perform your trauma so he can sell more subscriptions. I'm not a performing seal, Julian, Claire snapped, her old fire flickering. I know you're not, Julian said, walking over to her. He took her hands, his touch still the only thing that felt real in this city of plastic. But the machine is hungry. They've already scheduled the interviews, the photo shoots, the behind-the-scenes specials. They're turning our relationship into a promotional strategy. Earlier that day, Marcus Vane had shown them the first trailer. It was beautiful, but it was manipulative. It used the grainy video of Claire in the bathroom stall, the one she hated, and cut it against shots of Julian looking devastated. The tagline read, "The silence ends where the truth begins." He's using it, Claire whispered, her throat tightening. He's using the worst moment of my life to sell a TV show. And he's using my guilt to make me look sensitive, Julian added, his jaw clenching. We're not people to them anymore, Claire. We're IP, intellectual property. Claire looked at the racks of dresses, the silk, the lace, the thousands of dollars worth of fabric designed to make her look approachable yet mysterious. She felt the paper fortress rising again, but this time, Julian was inside it with her. What if we don't play along? Claire asked, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, dangerous idea. What do you mean? The premiere, the red carpet, the golden boy and his muse, that's the script Marcus wrote for us, Claire said, a small, rebellious smile touching her lips. But I'm the writer here, Julian. I've spent my life being silenced. I've spent my life being scripted. If we're going to walk into that fire, we're going to do it on our terms. Julian looked at her, and for a moment, the actor vanished. He saw the girl who had survived Oak Ridge, and he realized she was about to do something monumental. Whatever you're thinking, Julian whispered, pulling her close, I'm in. Let's give them a finale they didn't pay for. Outside, the billboards for the script of silence were being pasted across the city. The faces of Claire and Julian were 50 feet tall, looming over the traffic of Sunset Boulevard. They looked like gods, but inside the penthouse, they were just two people planning a revolution against the very world that worshipped them. They spent the night not talking about the show, but about the future. They talked about a place where the lights weren't so bright, a place where silence was just a quiet afternoon, not a psychological weapon. Do you think we can ever just be? Claire asked, her head on his chest. I don't know, Julian admitted, kissing the top of her head, but I'd rather try and fail with you than succeed with anyone else. The night before the premiere was unlike any other in Los Angeles. The city felt like it was breathing with a frantic, shallow rhythm. High above the traffic, the penthouse was a lighthouse of amber light, but inside there was no celebration. There was the precision of a heist. Claire stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She wasn't looking at the $15,000 dress Marcus Vane had chosen for her, a shimmering, innocent white gown designed to make her look like a fragile victim. Instead, she was looking at a suit, a sharp, midnight black velvet suit she had bought herself in secret. The white dress is a lie, Claire whispered, her reflection looking back with a fierce, newfound clarity. He wants me to look like someone who needs saving. He wants the world to pity the ghost girl. Julian walked up behind her, dressed in his own dark attire. He looked at the white dress hanging on the rack like a discarded skin. Then don't wear it, wear the truth, Claire. You've spent your life being told what to say and what to wear. Tonight, the red carpet is your page, write on it. They sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by printed schedules and PR talking points. Marcus had sent a script for the interviews. Talk about how the show saved you. Talk about how Julian was your hero. Cry if you can, people love tears. Claire took a red marker and drew a single, thick line through every word. We aren't going to follow their story beats, Julian, she said, her voice sounding like cold steel. When they ask about the video, I'm not going to cry. When they ask about our romance, we aren't going to give them the golden boy smile. We're going to tell them that the script of silence isn't a TV show anymore. It's an indictment. Julian leaned back, looking at the ceiling. He knew that what they were planning could end his career. The studio would call him unprofessional, unstable, a liability. He could lose the endorsements, the future roles, the millions of dollars. He looked at Claire, the girl who had walked into his life with a hoodie and a broken heart, and he realized he had already lost everything that didn't matter. They're going to hate us, you know, Julian said, a small, reckless grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The executives, the sponsors, they like their truths neat and tidy. They don't like it when the puppets cut the strings. Let them hate us, Claire replied, her hand finding his. I've been hated for being a freak my whole life. I might as well be hated for being free. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive rain and adrenaline. Outside, the searchlights for the Chinese theater were already testing their beams, cutting through the smog of the Hollywood basin. Claire felt a phantom drop of water on her neck, a memory of the bathroom stall, but this time she didn't shiver. She stood taller. She picked up her journal, the old, battered one from Oak Ridge, and wrote the final entry of the chapter. The red light is coming. They think they are the ones filming us. They don't realize that tonight, the world is going to see what happens when the shadow finally steps into the sun. Julian stood up and pulled her into his arms. There were no cameras here, no producers, no scripts, just the rhythmic beating of two hearts that had found each other in the dark. To the end of the script, Julian asked. To the beginning of the truth, Claire answered. The lights of the city flickered below them, unaware that the golden boy and the ghost girl were about to set the red carpet on fire. The air outside the Chinese theater was a physical wall of sound. Thousands of fans, hundreds of photographers, and the rhythmic, blinding strobe of 1,000 flashbulbs. This was the red light in its most primal form, the hunger of Hollywood for a new story to consume. The black studio SUV pulled up to the edge of the carpet. Inside, Marcus Vane was already waiting at the barricade, his face fixed in a triumphant grin, waiting for his white swan, Claire, and his golden boy, Julian, to step out and sell his show. The door opened. The roar of the crowd dipped for a fraction of a second in collective confusion. Julian stepped out first, not in his usual designer tuxedo, but in a simple, collarless black shirt and dark trousers, looking raw and unpolished. Then, he reached back and took Claire's hand. Claire stepped onto the carpet. She wasn't wearing the white victim dress. She was wearing the midnight black velvet suit, her hair slicked back, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She didn't look like a girl who had been bullied. She looked like the woman who had survived the war. Marcus Vane's smile froze. He moved toward them, his voice a frantic whisper over the noise. What the hell is this? Where is the dress? The sponsors? The sponsors can watch the show, Marcus, Claire said, walking past him without stopping. Her voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the chaos around her. Tonight, I'm not the mystery girl, I'm the author. They reached the center of the carpet, where the world's media was clustered. The lead interviewer for Global Entertainment, a man known for his biting sarcasm, thrust a microphone toward them. Claire, Julian, you look different tonight, the interviewer shouted. The world is talking about the video, Claire. They're calling you the face of fragility. How does it feel to finally have your silence broken by the world's support? Julian looked at Claire, giving her the space. He didn't step in to save her. He stood back, an equal, a witness. Claire looked directly into the main camera lens. She didn't look at the interviewer. She looked at the red light. I'm not the face of fragility, Claire said, her voice amplified by the speakers echoing across the boulevard. And my silence wasn't broken by you or by the internet or by this studio. I chose to speak when I was ready, and what I have to say isn't a marketing slogan. The crowd began to go quiet. People stopped cheering and started listening. The show you are about to watch, Claire continued, is about a man who was bought and a girl who was buried. It's about how this city turns human pain into profit. Julian Thorne didn't save me. We saved ourselves by refusing to lie for people like Marcus Vane anymore, so if you want to support me, don't pity me. Read my words, and then look at the people who try to silence you in your own lives and tell them that the shadows are tired of hiding. The silence that followed was more powerful than any applause. Marcus Vane looked like he wanted to vanish. The studio executives were frantic on their phones, but Julian walked up to Claire, ignored the cameras, and kissed her, not a press kiss, but a hard, real, I'm with you kiss. In that moment, the red light didn't feel like a predator. It felt like a spotlight on a new world. As they walked into the theater, leaving the stunned media behind, Claire felt the final barrier of her paper fortress fall. She wasn't a ghost, she wasn't a victim, she was Claire. We did it, Julian whispered as they took their seats in the dark, the film about to start. No, Claire replied, her hand locked in his. We just finished the prologue, now we go home.